I used to be so proud of my husband, Timothy. Every time someone asked about his frequent business trips, I'd beam with satisfaction and tell them how dedicated he was to his career. "He's in Portland this week," I'd say, or "he's closing a big deal in Seattle." The way their faces would light up with admiration made my chest swell with pride. I felt like I had won the lottery in the husband department, a man so committed to providing for our family that he'd sacrifice his comfort to travel across the Pacific Northwest for work. Those late-night phone calls from hotel rooms, the exhaustion in his voice when he'd tell me about his long days, the way he'd apologize for missing dinner again, it all painted the picture of a devoted provider. I never questioned it, not once. Our life in Boise felt perfect, like something straight out of a magazine. We had the white picket fence, the golden retriever named Max, and the kind of marriage that made other couples envious. Timothy would leave on Monday mornings with his perfectly packed suitcase, and I'd kiss him goodbye at the door, already counting down the days until Friday, when he'd return with stories from the road, and sometimes a small gift from whatever city he'd visited. I'd spend those days maintaining our beautiful home, tending to my garden, and catching up with friends, especially Sharon, my best friend since college. She was always there to listen when I complained about missing Timothy, always ready with a bottle of wine and a shoulder to lean on when the loneliness got too heavy. Sharon understood me like no one else ever had. We'd known each other for 15 years, ever since we were roommates at Boise State University. She was the maid of honor at my wedding, the first person I called when I got promoted at work, and the one who held my hand through my mother's cancer diagnosis 2 years ago. When Timothy started traveling more frequently for work about 8 months ago, Sharon became my anchor. She'd invite me over for dinner on the nights when the house felt too quiet, and we'd binge-watch romantic comedies while eating ice cream straight from the container. "You're so lucky to have a man who works so hard for you," she'd always say, and I'd nod in agreement, feeling grateful for both my husband and my best friend. The routine became second nature to me. Timothy would text me his flight details, and I'd screenshot them to share with Sharon, who always wanted to know when he'd be back so we could plan our girls' nights accordingly. She seemed genuinely interested in his work schedule, asking detailed questions about which cities he was visiting and how long he'd be gone. I thought it was sweet how much she cared about our marriage and wanted to make sure I wasn't too lonely while he was away. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was, how easily I accepted everything at face value without ever thinking to dig deeper. The signs were probably there all along, but love has a way of making you blind to the things you don't want to see. My days fell into a comfortable pattern during Timothy's absences. I'd wake up early, make coffee for one, and check my phone for his good morning text from whatever hotel he was supposedly staying in. The messages were always sweet and consistent. "Good morning, beautiful. Missing you already. Long day of meetings ahead." I'd respond with heart emojis and encouragement, telling him how proud I was of his dedication. Then I'd go to work at the marketing firm downtown, come home to walk Max, and usually end up at Sharon's house by evening. She lived just 10 minutes away in the same neighborhood, in a cozy townhouse that had become like a second home to me. We'd cook together, share a bottle of wine, and talk about everything and nothing until it was time for me to go home to my empty bed. The trust I had in Timothy was absolute and unwavering. When he told me he was in meetings all day, I believed him. When he said the hotel Wi-Fi was terrible and that's why he couldn't FaceTime, I accepted it without question. When he explained that his company was expanding their territory and needed him to cover more ground, I felt proud that they valued him so highly. I never thought to verify his stories or check up on him. Why would I? We'd been married for 7 years, together for 10, and I thought I knew him better than anyone. The idea that he might be lying to me, that he might be living a double life right under my nose, never even crossed my mind. I was living in a bubble of contentment, completely unaware that my entire world was built on deception. Friday evenings were always magical when Timothy returned from his trips. He'd walk through the door looking tired but happy to be home, and I'd run into his arms like we were in some romantic movie. He'd tell me stories about his week, the difficult clients, the successful presentations, the challenges of being away from home. I'd listen with rapt attention, asking questions and offering sympathy when he described particularly stressful situations. We'd order takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant, curl up on the couch with Max between us, and I'd feel like the luckiest woman in the world. Those reunion moments were so sweet, so filled with genuine affection, that they reinforced my belief in our solid marriage. How could someone fake that kind of love and tenderness? How could someone look me in the eyes and lie so convincingly while holding me close? Everything changed on a Tuesday night in October, when the autumn air was crisp and the leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and gold. Timothy had left that morning for what he said was a 3-day trip to Spokane, and I was settling in for another quiet evening at home when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Jason's name, Timothy's colleague from the office, and I answered with a smile, expecting maybe some work-related question or perhaps news about a project they were collaborating on. But Jason's voice sounded strange, hesitant, like he was struggling with something difficult. "Laura," he said slowly, "I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say this." My heart immediately started racing, and I gripped the phone tighter, preparing myself for bad news about Timothy's safety or health. Nothing could have prepared me for what Jason was about to reveal. "Laura, I just saw Timothy's car parked on Maple Street," Jason said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "But he told everyone at the office he was flying to Spokane this morning for the Henderson account." The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Maple Street was only 15 minutes from our house, in the heart of our own neighborhood. My mind immediately started racing, trying to find logical explanations. Maybe he'd forgotten something and come back to get it. Maybe his flight was delayed and he was killing time somewhere nearby. Maybe Jason was mistaken and it wasn't actually Timothy's car. But deep down, in that place where intuition lives, I knew something was terribly wrong. The way Jason's voice trembled told me he was as shocked as I was, and he wouldn't have called unless he was absolutely certain. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked Jason for more details. "Are you sure it was his car? The blue Honda with the dent on the passenger side?" My hands were shaking as I spoke, and I had to sit down on the kitchen counter to keep from falling over. Jason confirmed every detail: the license plate, the small scratch on the bumper from when Timothy had backed into our mailbox last spring, even the university parking sticker in the rear window. There was no doubt it was Timothy's car, parked right there in our own neighborhood while he was supposed to be hundreds of miles away on business. Jason apologized profusely for being the bearer of bad news, but he said he couldn't in good conscience keep quiet about it. "I thought you should know," he said softly. "I'm really sorry, Laura. I hope there's some innocent explanation." After hanging up with Jason, I sat in my kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at the wall and trying to process what I'd just learned. My first instinct was to call Timothy directly and demand an explanation, but something held me back. If he was lying about where he was, he'd probably just lie about why he was still in town. I needed to see for myself what was happening before I confronted him. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a work emergency that required him to stay local. Maybe a surprise he was planning for me. But the growing knot in my stomach suggested something much darker. I'd been married to Timothy long enough to know his patterns, his habits, his tells when he was being dishonest. Looking back on recent weeks, I started noticing things I'd previously dismissed. The decision to drive to Maple Street felt both terrifying and necessary. I grabbed my keys with trembling hands, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The 10-minute drive felt like an eternity, and I found myself hoping desperately that Jason had been wrong, that I wouldn't find Timothy's car where he said it was. But as I turned onto Maple Street, there it was, parked right in front of a familiar townhouse with warm light glowing from the windows. My blood turned to ice as I realized exactly whose house it was. Sharon's house. My best friend Sharon, who had been consoling me about Timothy's absences, who had been asking detailed questions about his travel schedule, who had been the perfect supportive friend through all those lonely evenings. The betrayal hit me like a tsunami, washing away 15 years of friendship and 7 years of marriage in one devastating moment. I parked across the street, hidden behind a large oak tree, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Timothy's car was definitely there, and through Sharon's front window, I could see two silhouettes moving around in what looked like comfortable familiarity. They weren't just talking. They were moving like people who lived together, like people who shared intimate space and routines. I watched as one figure handed something to the other, watched them embrace in a way that was definitely not platonic. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and I had to force myself to breathe slowly to keep from hyperventilating. This wasn't a chance encounter or a work meeting. This was clearly something that had been going on for a while, something planned and deliberate and devastating. The worst part wasn't just seeing Timothy there. It was realizing how perfectly Sharon had played her role as my supportive best friend. All those evenings when she'd comforted me about missing my husband, she'd known exactly where he was because he was with her. All those questions about his travel schedule weren't born from caring friendship. They were intelligence gathering to make sure their affair could continue undetected. Every time she told me how lucky I was to have such a dedicated husband, she'd been mocking me to my face. The depth of the deception was staggering, and I felt like the biggest fool who had ever lived. How long had this been going on? How many of Timothy's business trips had actually been extended stays at Sharon's house? How many times had they laughed about how easily they were deceiving me? I sat in my car for over an hour, watching and waiting, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to march up to Sharon's front door and confront them both immediately, to scream and cry and demand answers. But a stronger part of me knew that I needed to be smart about this. If I confronted them now, in the heat of emotion, they'd probably just deny everything or come up with some elaborate explanation. I needed proof, real evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. I needed to document what I was seeing, to gather enough information to protect myself legally and emotionally. So instead of acting on impulse, I took out my phone and started taking pictures. Photos of Timothy's car, photos of the house, photos with timestamps that proved he was here when he was supposed to be in Spokane. As I finally drove home that night, my mind was spinning with plans and emotions. The hurt was overwhelming. Not just the betrayal by Timothy, but the deeper cut of Sharon's deception. She had looked me in the eyes countless times over the past months, had held me while I cried about missing my husband, had offered comfort and support while secretly being the reason for my loneliness. The calculated cruelty of it was almost harder to bear than Timothy's infidelity. At least his affair was about passion or attraction or whatever drives people to cheat. But Sharon's betrayal was about friendship, about trust, about the sacred bond between women who are supposed to support each other. She had violated something even more fundamental than marriage vows, and I knew that forgiveness would be impossible. As I pulled into my driveway, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to get proof, and then I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly who these people really were. The next few days were the most difficult of my life, as I had to pretend everything was normal while secretly gathering evidence of my husband's betrayal. Timothy called me that evening from his hotel in Spokane, and I had to summon every ounce of acting ability I possessed to sound loving and supportive. "How was your first day of meetings, honey?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. He launched into an elaborate story about difficult clients and long presentations, describing details about a city he wasn't even in, while I stared at the photos on my phone that proved he was lying. The ease with which he deceived me was almost as painful as the deception itself. This wasn't a man struggling with guilt or remorse. This was someone who had become comfortable with living a double life. I spent Wednesday morning researching private investigators and divorce attorneys, but ultimately decided I could gather the evidence I needed on my own. I called in sick to work, claiming a stomach bug, and spent the day developing a plan. I needed more than just photos of Timothy's car at Sharon's house. I needed proof of the affair itself, documentation of how long it had been going on, and evidence of Sharon's active participation in the deception. I started by going through Timothy's things, looking for receipts, credit card statements, anything that might reveal the truth about his supposed business trips. What I found in his home office made my stomach turn. Hotel receipts from local establishments when he was supposed to be out of state, restaurant bills for 2 people during his solo business dinners, even a receipt from a jewelry store for a necklace I'd never seen. The jewelry store receipt was dated just 2 weeks ago, and it was for an expensive gold necklace that cost more than Timothy usually spent on my birthday and Christmas gifts combined. I knew with sickening certainty that Sharon was wearing that necklace, probably right now as she went about her day pretending to be my friend. The thought of confronting her directly made my hands shake with anger, but I forced myself to stick to my plan. I needed to catch them together, to get undeniable proof of their affair before I revealed that I knew. So I called Sharon, my voice artificially bright and cheerful, and asked if she wanted to have lunch later in the week. "Timothy's still in Spokane," I said, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth, and I'm feeling a bit lonely. Her response was perfectly crafted sympathy, offering to cook dinner for me that very evening and asking if I needed anything from the store. Thursday evening, I told Sharon I wasn't feeling well and couldn't make it to dinner, then positioned myself across from her house again to continue my surveillance. This time, I brought a better camera and settled in for a long wait. Around 7 o'clock, Timothy's car pulled into Sharon's driveway, and I watched him walk into her house like he belonged there. He wasn't carrying a suitcase or looking like someone who was making a quick stop. He moved with the confidence of someone coming home. Through the windows, I could see them cooking together, laughing, sharing wine like a couple celebrating another successful day of deception. I took dozens of photos and even managed to record a short video of them embracing in the kitchen. The intimacy between them was obvious and devastating, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out loud. The most damning evidence came when I decided to check Timothy's location history on our shared phone plan. As the primary account holder, I had access to all the location data, and what I found confirmed my worst fears. For the past 8 months, coinciding exactly with when his business travel had increased, Timothy's phone had been pinging from towers all around Boise during his supposed out-of-state trips. He'd been at Sharon's house, at local restaurants, at the mall, even at the gym we both belonged to, all while telling me he was hundreds of miles away. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Every single business trip had been a lie. He'd been living a parallel life right here in our hometown, probably spending more time with Sharon than he did with me. The systematic nature of the deception was breathtaking in its cruelty. Friday morning brought the most painful revelation of all. Timothy was supposed to return from his trip that afternoon, so I decided to do one final surveillance mission. I parked near Sharon's house early in the morning and watched as they had breakfast together on her back patio. They looked so comfortable, so domestic, like a real couple enjoying their morning routine. But what broke my heart completely was seeing Timothy wearing the watch I'd given him for our 5th anniversary, the one engraved with "Forever Yours, Laura," while he fed Sharon strawberries and kissed her forehead. The casual intimacy of the moment, the way they touched each other with such familiarity, told me this wasn't just a physical affair. They were in love, or at least Timothy thought he was. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis. This was a full relationship that had been growing while my marriage withered. I spent that Friday afternoon preparing for the confrontation I knew had to come. I printed out all the photos, organized the receipts and location data, and even created a timeline showing exactly when Timothy claimed to be traveling versus where he actually was. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. But more than that, I needed to prepare myself emotionally for what was about to happen. My marriage was over. That much was clear. But I also had to accept that my friendship with Sharon was dead, killed by her betrayal and manipulation. The woman who had been my closest confidant for 15 years, who knew all my secrets and fears and dreams, had been actively working to destroy my happiness. The grief I felt for that lost friendship was almost as intense as the anger I felt about Timothy's infidelity. When Timothy walked through our front door that evening, suitcase in hand and a smile on his face, I was sitting at the kitchen table with all the evidence spread out in front of me. "Welcome home from Spokane," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. The look of confusion on his face quickly turned to panic as he saw the photos and documents. For a moment, he tried to maintain the charade, opening his mouth to offer some explanation. But the weight of evidence was too much. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and I saw the exact moment when he realized his double life was over. "Laura, I can explain," he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "No," I said firmly, "you can't explain this, but you're going to sit down, and you're going to tell me the truth about everything. And then you're going to call Sharon and tell her to come over here because we're going to settle this tonight." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my life. Timothy sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations, and finally told me the truth. The affair had started 6 months ago, he said, when Sharon had called him crying about her own relationship problems. He'd gone over to comfort her, and one thing had led to another. What started as a single mistake had evolved into something deeper, something he claimed he couldn't control. "I never meant for it to happen," he kept saying, as if that somehow made it better. "I love you, Laura. I never stopped loving you. But his words felt hollow and meaningless after months of elaborate lies. If he loved me, how could he look me in the eyes every day and deceive me so completely? How could he hold me and make love to me while carrying on a full relationship with my best friend? When Sharon arrived 30 minutes later, her face went white as she saw the evidence spread across the table. Unlike Timothy, who had crumbled immediately when confronted, Sharon tried to maintain her composure. She sat down calmly, folded her hands in her lap, and looked me directly in the eyes as she attempted to justify the unjustifiable. "Laura, I know how this looks," she said, in that same soothing voice she'd used to comfort me during Timothy's absences. "But you have to understand, I was trying to protect you. I knew that if you found out about Timothy's feelings, it would destroy you. I thought if I could just manage the situation, maybe his feelings would pass and you'd never have to know." The audacity of her explanation took my breath away. She was actually trying to frame her betrayal as an act of friendship, as if sleeping with my husband was some kind of noble sacrifice. I let Sharon finish her ridiculous explanation before I responded, my voice cold and controlled despite the fury burning inside me. "Protect me?" I said slowly. "You think lying to my face for months, asking detailed questions about my husband's schedule so you could plan your affair, and comforting me while I cried about missing him, you think that was protecting me?" Sharon's composure finally cracked, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. But I felt no sympathy for her. "You sat in this very kitchen 2 weeks ago and told me how lucky I was to have such a devoted husband. You held my hand while I worried about him traveling so much for work. You were my best friend, Sharon. I trusted you with everything, and you used that trust to destroy my life." The pain in my voice was raw and undeniable, and even Timothy looked ashamed as he realized the full scope of what they had done to me. What hurt the most wasn't just the affair itself, but the calculated nature of Sharon's deception. As I confronted her with specific examples of her manipulation, the full picture became clear. She had been actively helping Timothy maintain his lies, coaching him on what to tell me, even suggesting restaurants and activities for their dates that she knew I wouldn't frequent. When I'd complained to her about feeling disconnected from Timothy lately, she'd encouraged me to give him space and not be clingy. When I'd mentioned wanting to surprise him on one of his business trips, she'd talked me out of it, saying it would be unprofessional and embarrassing. Every piece of advice she'd given me had been designed to protect their affair and keep me in the dark. The level of premeditation was staggering, and it made me realize that the Sharon I thought I knew had never really existed. Timothy tried to interrupt and deflect blame from Sharon, but I shut him down immediately. "You don't get to protect her now," I said firmly, turning to Sharon, who was crying openly. 15 years of friendship, and you threw it all away for a few months of sneaking around with my husband? When she tried to reach for my hand, I pulled away sharply, disgusted by her touch. I made my expectations crystal clear. Timothy was moving out immediately. Sharon was blocked from my life completely, and I wouldn't be keeping their secret. Everyone would know exactly who they really were. By the time they left that night, I felt devastated but liberated, finally free from their lies and ready to make sure their betrayal had real consequences. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months and immediately began executing my plan for justice. I created a detailed social media post with all the evidence, photos, timestamps, receipts, and location data, telling the complete story of Timothy's fake business trips and Sharon's calculated betrayal. Within hours, the post had dozens of comments from shocked friends and family members, and I felt a deep satisfaction watching their carefully constructed lies crumble in real time. The community response was swift and decisive. Timothy's reputation at work was destroyed when his colleagues realized he'd been lying about business travel, and Sharon found herself ostracized by our entire social circle. 3 days later, as I was changing the locks on my house and finally feeling like I could breathe again, the doorbell rang with a flower delivery. My heart sank, thinking Timothy was trying some pathetic gesture of reconciliation, but the card made me smile for the first time in weeks. "Laura, you deserve so much better than lies and betrayal. Would you like to have coffee sometime and talk about the truth for a change? Jason." I looked out my window at my fresh start, my reclaimed life, and realized that sometimes the most devastating betrayals clear the path for something genuinely beautiful. The flowers weren't from the man who had lied to me for months, but from the one who had cared enough to tell me the truth.